In the process of considering the question of how to honor the theme of this conference, Building the Field, the Planning Committee was committed to presenting plenary sessions throughout this week and weekend that would help us consider how we work together here at the conference and how we continue to collaborate as we return to our home communities. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Erin Castro, and the research collaborative that she has built at the University of Utah are part of the vital work to build the foundation of this field. Erin is leading the way in supporting efforts to answer what should be considered the big questions in the field. What is higher education in prison? What is the purpose of higher education in prison? How do we know when we are doing higher education in prison well? Questions that we in the field will need to work together to answer from within. Erin and her team are at the forefront of working to provide a language for many of us to take into the world as we continue to advocate for our programs and projects and organizations, and as we collaborate with policymakers, college and university administrators, departments of corrections, and more broadly, just the general public. For example, until a recent publication by Erin and her team, the question of how many higher education in prison programs existed was often met with a highly nuanced response without providing an actual answer. Now, because of their work, this question can be met head on. And if this work of helping move the field towards more holistic, ethical, and appropriate research methods, as well as building a higher education in prison program at the University of Utah, isn't enough, I also want to acknowledge that I believe Erin has registered the youngest member of our community for this conference. Well done. I'm proud to introduce Dr. Erin Castro, my colleague, collaborator, and friend, to deliver this year's opening keynote address, working towards a future of advocacy, equality, equity, and quality, researching the field of higher education in prison. Please join me in welcoming Erin.
Thanks to Mary for the kind introduction and to Naomi for the warm welcome. I'm excited to kick us off this year. I wasn't able to attend the pre-conference today, but it seems like there's just been some wonderful energy emerging from that. And so I'm excited to engage in a dialogue with everyone tonight. I am going to share some highlights from the Research Collaborative on Higher Education in Prison at the University of Utah. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned, share some insights into where I think we should go, and then also raise a few points of concern, some challenges that I think that we should take on in this field. To begin, I'd like to address what sort of feels like an elephant in the room at this conference. It's been my experience in attending and listening to presentations on quote-unquote research that there seems to be some pretty common shared reactions. There's a few of us who nerd out and get really excited. There's a whole group of us who kind of raise a bit of suspicious eyebrows. And then there's kind of a group of us that don't really care. Like, I'm not sure that that has much to do with kind of what I'm thinking about. And I get it. I don't think that much research has been accessible to nor relevant to the everydayness of college and prison. When we started our on-site programming 2 years ago at the University of Utah, it was impossible to find evidence to support the initial infrastructure and organization of a sustainable college and prison program, and I'm seeing a few heads nod, like, yes, this is a problem. I turned to some wonderful people in this room, and I drew upon my experience working for the Education Justice Project as a grad student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I used that experience and some of the wonderful documents that all of you shared to really guide our efforts. But not everyone has access to those networks. And I do think that the lack of theory and the lack of evidence points to an urgent need in our field. It's a beautiful tradition, so please hear me. I think we should keep doing it. We should keep sharing. But it does illuminate the need for theory and research that can inform practice. What I needed 3 years ago, and I gave this person purple hair, I needed a how-to manual to start college and prison partnerships, and I also needed evidence to demonstrate the value of higher education in prison to my community. And it simply wasn't available. And tonight as I stand here, at least on a credible scale, I'm not sure that information is available right now. In addition to the challenge of building viable programs, there's also the fact that the field is attracting more and more funders. This is a good thing. Increasingly, as private and philanthropic organizations and government entities allocate funds to support prison higher education, they're doing so, however, by relying on disparate and detached information to guide decision-making. So without foundational research, such as being able to answer the question that Mary proposed, how many colleges and universities provide higher education in prison, we're tremendously limited in our ability to strategically plan, to plan for the future in which all of us in this room, and more importantly, our students who cannot be here, play a critical role. In short, what this means is that we're trying to build a field of higher education in prison. And so what does it take to do that? For me, it means, at least, starting at the foundation and asking what might appear to be a set of pretty rudimentary questions. What is higher education in prison? How many colleges and universities participate? And here's the important one, why? Why are they doing this? These questions are about laying the necessary infrastructure for a field of theory and practice. However, at the present time, it seems like the majority of research from which we pull doesn't really serve the purposes of higher education in prison specifically. So certainly as an emerging field, this makes sense. As a consequence, however, important discussions related to addressing persistent challenges in the field, and I had a number of those conversations last night just at dinner, more so today, this morning. All of us are facing unique challenges as we direct programs, work in programs, try to expand programming that really can only be answered by other people doing this work. These kinds of conversations in conference spaces like this and other conferences tend to be dominated by values that are outside the field of higher education in prison. And I'm talking specifically here such as risk reduction or reduced recidivism. In fact, higher education in prison has long been dominated by values that simply aren't educational. And why? Why should higher education in prison be theorized any differently than higher education in general? Either we believe that incarcerated college students are fundamentally different than non-incarcerated college students, or we don't. And if we don't believe this, and we really shouldn't believe this, and what I mean is that incarcerated college students are somehow fundamentally or inherently different than non-incarcerated college students across the US, then the only really difference is the context of the prison. Now I can already hear some of you saying, yeah, but Erin, the prison's pretty important. Yeah, it is. I'm not saying it's not, but in much the same way, the prison shouldn't dictate what it means to be a human being, for example. It shouldn't dictate what educational opportunities are made available inside. There's also a part of research that I want to mention, given our conversation tonight, and that is the long, violent history of unethical, exploitative, and quite frankly, irresponsible research that happens on prisons and on incarcerated people, and I use the word "on" here quite purposefully. Research projects that are poorly designed, those that do not seriously consider issues of coercion and consent, those that deny educational opportunities to one group of eligible students in order to test the effectiveness of that intervention. I'm seeing a ton of heads nod, of that intervention on another group of eligible students. Research projects that require incarcerated students to consent to research participation as a stipulation for program enrollment, et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of experiences have given many of us in this room a bad feeling about research, and rightly so, and I want to acknowledge that. But I don't think that's the kind of research that we need. I don't think it's the kind of research that we need to facilitate either. Let me be clear that reduced recidivism is important. And it is crucial for the people in fields of criminology and related disciplines to responsibly study it. Their fields are focused on the study of crime, and so that makes sense. But in the field of higher education and prison, measuring recidivism is simply not what we do. The purpose of higher education and prison is higher education. And higher education is driven by philosophies and outcomes that are born of educational theory and the relationship between schools and society. In educational theory, we ask questions like, what kind of society do we desire? And how can formal education help us get there? How do we help students learn to question normative assumptions and social arrangements, to identify contradictions and work for a society with less suffering? In critical pedagogy, we ask things like, how does education influence what we learn to value? What kind of learning is essential for self-actualization and humanization? How do we unlearn the normalization of dominance, such as the acceptance and justification of rampant social inequality, misogyny, transphobia, what Freire referred to as reading the word and reading the world? In critical race theory, we ask questions about the relationship between the maintenance of white supremacy and educational goals. Whose interests are served by current practices? How are contemporary practices of quote-unquote merit a reflection of white middle-class values? What can an anti-racist society look like? And again, how can formal education help us get there? In short, I say this passionately and with love, reduced recidivism is not an educational outcome. I'm done. Talk to you later. And so that begs the question, what is an educational outcome for higher education in prison? And my answer to that briefly is that it's the same for incarcerated students as it is for non-incarcerated students. My own institution lists the following as expected educational outcomes for various undergraduate programs, and you can pull this right off our website. We are a research-intensive institution. If you are affiliated with an institution of higher education, you can do the same right now. A recognition of the need for and an ability to engage in lifelong learning. This is from the undergraduate degree in engineering. Identify, analyze, and assess concepts and approaches in a variety of sources and perspectives. This is from art history. Demonstrate intellectual curiosity, critical thinking, and clinical judgment in the planning and provision of client-centered health promotion and healthcare. It's from nursing. Identify, critically analyze, and assess information from a variety of sources and perspectives. This is the Honors College. Think in terms of abstractions or models, including graphical and mathematical models, economics. Learn to use a variety of research methods as a means of understanding the social world and human interaction, sociology. My point here is that there are multiple frameworks in the field of higher education to assess things like student success and program quality, climate, and student engagement. And here's where I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. Nor do I think we should. Yes, there are unique circumstances and challenges our students face, and we have a responsibility for learning more about what those are and creating viable pathways for higher education as re-entry alongside our students. But devising a separate set of learning outcomes and quality metrics for higher education in prison wavers on the implication that incarcerated students are fundamentally different than non-incarcerated college students. And this simply isn't the case. I also think it sets up a dangerous possibility of othering and tokenization. It leaves us with little ability to counter public narratives around the purposes of higher education in prison that are rooted in deficit assumptions about incarcerated people. One of the biggest challenges we face in the field of higher education in prison is that we can't yet, certainly with a great degree of credibility, answer basic questions around issues of access, participation, completion, and outcomes. Who's participating in college during incarceration? What shared characteristics do participants have? What exactly do students have access to? And what do they do when they're finished? Any college or university can provide both broad and specific information about each incoming cohort of students, such as admissions applications, course-taking patterns, grades, GPA, how many courses a student enrolls in per semester, time to degree and/or departure from the institution, financial federal aid awards, grants, health records, and increasingly post-graduation information such as self-perceived value of the experience, civic participation, employment, among other metrics. In the field of higher ed, we can also answer questions in the aggregate about cohorts on a national level. We know, for example, much descriptive information about total undergraduate enrollments in the US. And I'm just putting this up here as an example. This was pulled, this is 2016 data from the National Center for Education Statistics. And what it's done is it's divided total enrollments between 2-year institutions and 4-year institutions, and then it's disaggregated those data by race. So this is the kind of information that we have available to us when we think about higher education students broadly. Where students in prison fit in to this information is the question that we need to be asking, if they fit in at all right now in terms of data capturing, and we can certainly talk about that later if people have questions. So we know this information because colleges and universities are required to report it to the federal government if they receive Title IV funding. This is how students receive federal aid. It's also how faculty and other people at the institution receive competitive grants via the federal government, right? Most institutions in the US are Title IV, able to pull funds through Title IV. There are over 4,000 Title IV funded schools in the US, and to date, our research team at the University of Utah has counted at least 230 institutions that are affiliated with or providing higher education in prison. I'm going to talk about this specifically in just a minute. Higher education is collecting these metrics, and when I say higher education, I mean the integrated post-secondary education data system through the National Center for Education Statistics. We're collecting these metrics because we're trying to answer the questions that I mentioned above. Who's participating? Where are they coming from? Who's graduating? How long is it taking folks? Who's not graduating? These data collection metrics or measures are not happening perfectly, but it does provide some baseline information for us to ask better questions. Again, we have no idea on a systemic level how many incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people are participating in and completing higher education right now. We can't talk, and I mean in terms, anecdotally we can all say things, right? But empirically, with evidence, we can't talk about what experiences they have. We can't really talk about their information about their post-completion outcomes, what it is that they want, what special needs that they have. Right now, institutions are not required to report this information about incarcerated status to the federal government. While in theory, it might make sense for us to say, well, let's just have them start collecting it, there's at least 2 challenges to that. The first is that folks with systems impact experiences and incarceration histories overwhelmingly shoulder the burden of disclosure. It is on them. They're the ones that are going to face the consequences for disclosing their status. And second, institutions of higher education, by and large, do not have standardized policies and practices in place to protect students who disclose. And then also what to do with that information. Who should have access to it? How should we think about it? How should it be determined in terms of allowing someone access to the institution, or getting a job, or getting a TA-ship, or a graduate assistantship? We're not there yet in answering those. So in short, there's great risk for formerly incarcerated people to disclose that information without some serious protections in place. But this kind of information is important because it can help us better understand who's participating, who's being successful, potentially who's not, and it can also assist us in ensuring broad access for underserved and disadvantaged groups. It can help institutions measure how well they're doing against their missions, and it's really integral to long-term strategic planning. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think we have to be thoughtful about how we engage it. Collecting information about academic pathways or post-secondary pathways is important for the same reasons. Post-secondary pathways is a term broadly used to define an integrated academic program. Think completion of terminal degree programs, such as certificates, associate's and bachelor's degree pathways, graduate pathways. Are we familiar with this terminology of pathways? The metaphor of a pathway, if we think a busy highway, for example, is useful because it demonstrates how important the structural foundations of pathways are for students. Students can only travel where a road is paved. Students need to know what speed to travel. They need clear signs when to exit or merge onto another highway. They may need roadside assistance. Stick with me on this metaphor for a minute. But this is why the study of a structure is important. It's not just about individual students picking and choosing. What pathways have we paved for students to travel? This is not unique to the field of higher education and prison. This is what we do in higher ed. This is how we study the field. The other thing we know from the literature, we can thank LA for this picture, is that the most effective pathways, that is, those are the most useful for students, the ones that they travel on most efficiently, their time to degree is shorter, their satisfaction post-graduation is higher, are those with many off and on ramps, many opportunities to make different decisions and to integrate what was previously traveled toward a new destination rather than starting the trip all over again. And this, for all of you who are offering college prep, this is why this is so important. We have to build ways for folks to get onto pathways. And if they decide to do something else, allow them an exit ramp so they just didn't kind of lose everything they've just traveled. The other thing we know is that they should be enjoyable too, and we can thank Illinois for this sign right here. So in 2015, I started asking these questions about the field of higher education and prison. And 2 years later, we launched the Research Collaborative for Higher Education in Prison at the University of Utah. We also have an on-site college and prison program that we offer in two prisons, a women's prison and a men's prison in the Utah State Prison in Draper. So the collaborative is a dynamic team of researchers, myself, graduate students, I have to do this, a graduate student in North Carolina, Haruna, who is here, Stephanie Aguilar Padilla, who is our undergraduate intern, who is also here. And we're working with many of you in this room. You've probably talked to me on the phone or one of our team members on the phone or have been back and forth with us via email. And I want to thank you, because what I'm about to share tonight is not possible unless you share that information with our team. And so this is kind of a love letter, a thank you of sorts, as well as a demonstration of what we can do when we share information with one another. I also want to say that there are lots of things to study, but what we're interested here is advocacy. We're not simply counting the number of post-secondary education programs in prison in the US. We're trying to document what exactly those opportunities are, to whom they're afforded, and what that looks like. We want to make sense of all the programs and then apply frameworks from the field of higher education in prison to develop theory and to hold colleges and universities accountable. We want to compel colleges and universities to enhance and fulfill their missions by extending coursework and programs into prisons and jails, and to make it easier for folks with incarceration histories to enroll in quality higher education post-release and complete degrees. There is more that colleges and universities can do, and so through our research, we want to help them do it well. So let me talk a little bit about our first project at the Collaborative. In 2015, we started asking some questions, and then in 2017, we really started with intense data collection, and we wanted to know how many higher education and prison programs exist in the US. Turns out that's not an easy question to answer. We turned to wonderful free resources in the field, including Harvard University's Prison Studies Project, National Directory of Higher Education Programs in Prison, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign's Higher Education in Jails and Prison Programming List. I strongly encourage folks to add their information to these free websites if you haven't already. For those of us who are trying to start programs, it really is a wonderful resource to kind of look up our state and see if there's anyone else out there who we can talk to. We soon realized, however, that there were some definitional and theoretical work that needed to be done before we could answer this question. We came together concerned with two issues. First, equity, meaning who has access right now. If we were to say, we're in Indiana, and however many prisons we have here, who in Indiana prisons has access to higher education in prison right now? It's a difficult thing to answer. But we're able to answer that outside of prison, and so we started as researchers with that question. Who has access? And then we wanted to know what exactly people have access to. What resulted from our initial conversations was a question about evidence. Could we actually answer these questions? It's one thing to be able to say, oh yeah, there's 230 college and prison programs, but I'm not sure we know what that means. And we were, at the forefront of our minds is the issues that I mentioned before about research. As a collaborative, we do not conduct research on incarcerated people, period. So what we needed to do is to kind of develop some proxies. How could we get at equity without talking to incarcerated college students? And how could we get at quality without doing the same? We started by going back to prison-university engagements and taking a deeper look at their multiple components. We needed to know, what does higher education mean? And what does program mean exactly? Now, the question of what higher education means outside of prison is uncomplicated. The National Center for Education and Statistics, this is reflected in the 1965 Higher Ed Act. It's the provision of a formal instructional program whose curriculum is designed primarily for students who are beyond the compulsory age for high school. This includes programs whose purpose is academic, vocational, continuing professional education, and excludes avocational and adult basic education programs. And so we were like, cool, we'll just go with this definition. But then we started running into what we all see in prisons. There are no clear delineations among some of this work. And I've only captured some here, but the umbrella of quote-unquote correctional education includes at least the following programs: GED or high school programming, adult basic education, treatment programming, sentence-mandated programming, avocational education, adult secondary education, career and technical education, vocational education, competency-based programming, college prep, professional education, post-secondary education. I'm sure I've missed something. So what we needed to do as a research team is define post-secondary education as distinct from quote-unquote correctional education, in the same ways that we make these distinctions for non-incarcerated students. So we're not trying to develop a hierarchy here, but we do need to be clear about what we're talking about. We also wanted to be inclusive, right? So in terms of the hierarchy, there are many valuable players in this field, just as there are in the non-carceral world. But just in the same way as we can clearly define what a high school diploma curriculum looks like and a GED program looks like, we can do that for higher education. And we need to. So, turning back to the literature, talking with you, programs, to try to figure out what you're doing, we came up with the following definition. Formal instruction provided to students who have earned or concurrently earning a GED or high school diploma or equivalent secondary credential. This also includes dual enrollment. Includes programs whose purpose is academic, vocational, and continuing professional education. Excludes avocational, adult basic ed, adult secondary ed, and other formal programming efforts not affiliated with an institution of higher education. Please note, there's nothing on here about credit or non-credit. My own program at the University of Utah, we're working on it, but we're not for credit yet, right? So there's nothing about that here. I want to point that out. So what we needed to do is clearly draw our lines of inclusion and exclusion criteria. What counted as a higher education in prison program and what didn't count? And what did we do with those programs that didn't count, or those efforts, as you'll hear me talk about in a second, those engagements? We needed the programs or the efforts or the engagements or the partnerships to meet our definition of post-secondary education. And let me just say the biggest reason that we excluded programs was that they didn't have an admissions process. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Require a GED or high school diploma for admission or an equivalent. So we've got 12 states in the US right now where you can if you demonstrate that you will benefit from higher education, you can enroll in higher education, right? So that also counts. So if you're enrolled in the institution that enrolled you, stamped approval, right? And as a program you looked at that, then we counted that as well. We needed for institutions to be accredited by the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. I'll talk about accreditation a little bit later. This is CHEA. This is our national organization that credits institutions of higher education. And then the program needed to work with students, adults who were, or students who were housed in federal or state adult facilities. And I will talk a little bit later about where we're changing and kind of expanding the inclusion and exclusion criteria for our kind of next round of data collection. We are going to be including jails and juvenile facilities. So what did we do? We began in 2015. We searched public directories, and we did this systematically, right? So we would, every Monday, kind of start, and we did this for a period of almost 12 weeks. We would get Google alerts. We looked at individual states' websites. We looked at the NCHEP program. We also worked with the Association of Federal and State Corrections Directors. We emailed and phone calls to programs, to prisons, to jails, and to universities. And so we kind of, if you think about it, we have kind of three players here. We have the institution of higher education that's kind of involved, and sometimes we have a nonprofit that's also involved. So we have those two layers. We also have the facility in which programs are enacted, so those can be at least one, if not more. And then we have the people who work in those programs. And what we were trying to do is, can we get the same information from everyone? Is everyone giving us the same information? The answer to that is often no. We found that out really quickly. And so what we needed to do is devise a system that would allow us to find out if there are discrepancies. And if there were discrepancies, we had to call back. That's why for some of you in this room, you probably have received a number of kind of emails from me asking for very specific information. And that's the reason why, is that we want to be clear about what we're collecting, and I'm going to demonstrate that in just a second. So in order to kind of test whether or not what we were doing reflected the field, right? Like, it's one thing to do research in this field and say, yes, there are X number of programs, here's what programs mean, and kind of walk away. But what we wanted to do is to ensure that we were capturing what prison engagements with universities look like. And as you know, this is a messy, beautiful field. These engagements, these partnerships, re-entry programs, in-prison programs, there are all sorts of things that are happening. There's no standardization, and that's partly what makes this such a beautiful field. We needed to know, as researchers, are our data capturing mechanisms accurately reflecting what we're doing, or are we trying to stuff these programs into some preconceived boxes? So we tested it. And I hope Mary will forgive me, but I'm going to share an example of what we did and what we continue to do. So we decided to go program by program. And what we have here is the prison education program. It is formally affiliated with St. Louis University. What does it do? Well, it's a 4-year private institution in Missouri, and it operates in 2 facilities. FCI Greenville, which is in Illinois, it's a federal facility, and Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center, it's a state facility in Missouri. The prison program offers both credit and non-credit coursework. In Greenville, the program supports a college prep program and the prison arts and education program, represented here. I am not a graphic design person, so I apologize about that. And who do they offer it to? Well, they offer it to incarcerated college students, and they offer it face-to-face. This means that non-incarcerated instructors from SLU's campus go in and teach courses to incarcerated students in this facility. So in Eastern facility, they have a non-credit and a credit-bearing track. On the non-credit track, we see the same thing. On the credit-bearing track, we see an associate degree pathway, and that's an Associate of Arts specifically. Who do they offer it to? Well, they offer it to a group of incarcerated students, and then they offer it to staff who work at the facility. And this is highlighted. I'll show you in just a second for the reason why. How do they do that? Well, they do it through face-to-face instruction. The college prep program is offered, again, face-to-face instruction at this facility. The prison arts and education program is also offered face-to-face instruction. And the reason this staff is highlighted is because any staff member in the state of Missouri can come and attend that program. Now, we're collecting a number of pieces of information in addition to this. I am trying to save myself and everyone by putting what I can on a PowerPoint slide. But we're collecting specific information about the prison or the facility, specifically about things like the numbers of folks incarcerated, and can we get a ratio of how many people are participating in the program relative to the numbers of people incarcerated in the prison. That will give us a percentage of the people who are actually being served. We also have conducted some preliminary geographical analysis. We, in the field, talk about college and university deserts. I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but we see the same thing reflected in this field. There are concentrations of opportunity, and then there are deserts, where if you're incarcerated, you don't have access to anything. So this takes us back to the question, how many higher education and prison programs exist? Do we count St. Louis University's program as one program? And if we do, what does that actually tell us? If we say that St. Louis University has a prison education program, what do we learn from that? And part of what we're putting forth is that that's not really the language we want to use, although it's the language I keep using, right? We need to be a bit more specific about what it is that we mean. And I'm going to show one more example to just illuminate some of the complexity here. Now, Sean's in the back. I have offered to buy drinks if any part of this is wrong. But the kind of lightning bolt behind college prep is an indication that it's offered at all sites. But how many institutions do we have across the top? 9? Yes. In 6 facilities? And if we were just to count Hudson Link as one program, again, we can't answer the question about equity, who has access, and we can't answer the question about quality. What is it that they have access to? And so this is what we're attempting to do with every program. And this is why, when I call and I'm asking these questions, we want to accurately reflect what it is that you're doing. What we're working on with some folks at the University of Utah right now is to make this easier for programs so that when you connect with us, this will auto-populate. And we can send it to you, and you can sign off and say, yes, that's correct. No, that's incorrect. Hey, we added something. I'm looking at Matt, because Matt's going to help us do that. Because it's important. It's important that we can trace these pathways. So, given this, how many colleges and universities provide prison higher education? That is the edited version that allowed us to kind of change a bit of what we're focusing on here. We're focusing on which institutions of higher education are involved and which prisons are being served. What happens in between, right, we've got to map that out. That might be considered a program, cool. But we still need these 2 data points. According to our count, and this was last updated in February of this year, we have 230 institutions of higher education that are affiliated with providing in-prison higher education. I want to provide a few caveats. Since I accepted the invitation to the opportunity to speak tonight, we've had at least a dozen programs start up. And this is a good thing, right? But I think what it does is it's reflective of a dynamic and rapidly changing field. And so our research is like we are constantly updating. What we've committed to doing, though, is returning to the data at least once a year and re-upping everything. So you will be hearing from us again in the spring. So I say at least because I'm certain that we're missing some engagements on this. So here's the institutional type distribution, and I hope that you can read this. Can you hear me if I walk over here? Yeah. Okay. So at 55%, we have public 2-year institutions. Community colleges and two-year institutions are providing the overwhelming majority of prison higher education right now, and this is a beautiful thing. Remember the on-ramps that I was talking about earlier? This is absolutely what we need. It's what we talk about in the field of higher education for other underserved student communities, undocumented students, first-generation college students, students with disabilities, students of color, post-traditional students, right? This is what we talk about. This is why pathways are so important. At 25%, representing a quarter of the institutions, we have private four-year institutions. Public four-year institutions, like a University of Utah, we're at 17%. For-profit institutions, four-year institutions, are at 4% or 2%. I'll say something on that in just a second. And then private 2 years, right now we only have 1. I know that the for-profit sector is underrepresented here, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that it's very difficult to find out what they're doing. Yeah, I mean, I thank you to everyone in this room who has gotten back to us. Again, come up to us, update your program information, let's set up times to talk. But the biggest challenge that we faced, particularly in trying to connect with proprietary institutions, is that they simply would not get back to us. And that's too bad. Because what we do know from proprietary institutions is that we have a number of self-paced distance programs that are happening inside prisons. And we have no way of capturing that right now outside of if you're working in a prison and you talk to us and you tell us. And so I am certain that we are underrepresenting the reach of proprietary institutions at this point. We're going to continue to work on it. What else do we know? Well, we know that of the Title IV degree granting institutions in the US, over 4,000, we have approximately 5%. So the other way of saying that is only 5% of all eligible colleges and universities in the US are providing higher education in prison. This is a wonderful opportunity for them to step up and to do something, and we want to help them do it well. So let's invite them to NCHEP. So what does all this mean? One of the challenges that colleges and universities faced and have long faced, this is not a new issue and it's certainly not distinct to prison higher education, is the tension between access and quality. This is a central theme driving our work at the Collaborative. How do we broaden access, so creating more of those on-ramps, getting more institutions of higher education involved, while ensuring that expanded opportunity is of high quality? And when I say high quality, I don't mean one kind of instruction, that we all have to go in from universities into prisons and teach face-to-face and sit down and do Socratic method. Like, I'd love that. But there are lots of ways of measuring quality in the field of higher education. And the Council for Higher Education Accreditation gives us guidance as to what those quality metrics are. If you're doing an online program or a distance-based program or you're broadcasting into a prison, those quality frameworks do exist, and I guess what I'm suggesting is that we tap into those. We don't create a whole new set of standards. We go to the standards that have already been used and are being used by the field. So too few colleges and universities are providing post-secondary education. We know that two-year colleges are providing the bulk of it. We also know that there are some questionable providers of post-secondary higher education. And I do want to talk about this point. The rapid and largely unregulated growth of for-profit institutions in the last 2 decades fuels the tension that we're concerned about, the tension between quality and access. And they do this by proactively, many would argue, myself included, predatorially, targeting underserved and marginalized populations, including students of color, and we can look this up. I'm not making this up. Folks of color, veterans, first-generation college students, undocumented students, students experiencing homelessness, students with disabilities, and increasingly migrant and refugee students who qualify for state aid. What has long been the case, dating back to at least 1972 when the Higher Education Act allowed proprietary institutions to receive Title IV funding, incarcerated and formerly incarcerated students. So certainly not all for-profit institutions are bad actors. Let me be very clear here. But what we do see is that they do represent the overwhelming majority of institutions in federal lawsuits alleging student aid fraud. Or at least they were before the Trump administration eliminated the special team at the Education Department charged with investigating possible fraudulent activities among for-profit schools. So let me say at the very least, institutions who are currently under investigation for student aid fraud, or if they ever have been in the past, should not be able to serve incarcerated students. And this is happening, and I know I don't have to tell this room this. It is happening all over, and I think it's a real challenge, and I think it's one that we in the field can address. I think we need to push them out. Let's talk about how we can do that. So it is a larger problem in the field, though, too, and I think that's what kind of gives me hope here. This isn't unique to our field, and anyone who hasn't read Tressie McMillan Cottom's book, Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy, please add it to your reading list. It's excellent. The Council for Higher Education Accreditation, again, the leading organization in the field, refers to institutions that misbehave in this space as quote-unquote degree and accreditation mills. And they caution in one of their most recent reports that such institutions pose one of the greatest threats to access and equality of opportunity. So there are also institutions that don't have for-profit status but act like it in this specific space of prison higher education. And these are institutions that chase state and federal aid. They only serve students who are eligible for state and federal aid. We need to be aware of those too. We are challenged in capturing that. But again, we know as a field that this exists, and I think we do need to come together to address it. That being said, let me just say that I know there's a ton of momentum behind reinstating Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated people. I cannot get through this talk without saying emphatically that advocacy to reinstate Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated people must happen alongside serious guardrails for protections against exploitation for incarcerated college students and stipulations of quality. Anytime someone asks you about it, let's insert that into the discourse because it's not there right now. And our students need for us to do that. So expected learning outcomes for programs. Earlier I had suggested that, well no, I actually just stated, reduced recidivism is not an educational outcome. And so what does that mean as programs? What should we be doing? And I'll talk just a little bit as I close about this, but I think we can go to our institutions at this point and look up exactly what they define as learning outcomes for their degree pathways, for their undergraduate enrollment, for whatever program that you're offering in the prison. And I think we can start there. And then finally, we need much more information. And part of the work that we're doing at the collaborative is to kind of help pull this together in a systematic way. Let me talk a little bit about what we're doing in terms of the research. We are engaged in a longitudinal project, meaning we're in this for the long haul. We're currently in phase 1 right now. And we're talking with all of you to try to better understand your programs. In my vision of kind of where this goes, after each program kind of has a conceptual map on our end, after we've kind of made sure that we understand it, is that we have ambassadors in each state, or we have ambassadors in regions that can help us verify this information. I know having someone from North Carolina on our team has already helped, right? We're in Utah. And so we're really looking for folks to kind of help us with this. Like I said, we are going to streamline the process. We want to certainly help programs. In phase 2, we are going to pilot and launch a survey. So sometime next year, we're going to survey, hopefully all of you, And we're going to do that after getting some feedback from you, right? We certainly have questions along the lines of what I just shared that we want to answer. But we also want to be really valuable to the field. What questions do you have? What questions do you need answers to in order to do your job better? How can you run a better program? How can you make a better experience for your students? And how can we, as a team of researchers, devise a tool that can help us get some answers to that outside of our own little bubbles? And so please talk to us. The other thing I'll say here, back to the expected learning outcomes, is are we familiar with kind of an IPO model at all? Inputs, right? Process, outputs, inputs over here, process, outputs, right? And if we think about all of our programs, just very basic, roll with me for a second. What are the inputs into the program right now? So did anybody participate in the Theory of Change workshop today? Phenomenal. Yeah, this is essentially that, right? So does my program have an admissions process? Is that process clearly articulated to students? Are there on-ramps to my program so that students who are not yet eligible can become eligible, right? Those might be some of the inputs. The process, what is it that we're doing? What are we offering? Are there processes in place for students to access things like a library, to do their own research with databases, to take advantage of all the extracurricular and supplemental instruction opportunities that are already on campus? Can they create a student advisory board? We're trying to do that in Utah. We can't call it that, so we have to call it something different. But what are we doing in terms of process to reflect the experiences that students would have if they were not incarcerated and they were on our campuses? And then if we think, so inputs, process, if we think of the outputs, what is it that we want our students to know related to that? If we go back to the learning outcomes that I shared earlier, do we want them to have any of those kinds of things? And I can't stress this enough, these are not unique to the prison. They're unique to learning. So I'm going to close because I really want to have a conversation tonight, but I want to say just a few things. I don't know if anybody's heard the news out of California from last night. So it seems like each day lately I dread listening to the news. I fear for the safety of my family and for the people about whom I care so deeply, our queer and trans communities, Black and brown communities, migrants, asylum seekers, friends and strangers who study various practices of faith. I could go on. If I'm being honest, I'm tired. I'm quite sick of bearing witness to all of this human suffering that is born of the potent combination of rampant individualism and widespread disinvestment in social programming. And a president who fuels the flames of hatred. We can talk about that later. I ache for people who wake up each morning under the immense anxiety of not knowing whether they'll be the next target of hate-filled ignorance and violence. In my most rage-filled moments, and believe me, there are many, I know intimately one thing. Education is really our only way out of this. Education that urges us to ask questions about ourselves and the kind of people we want to be in the world. Education that compels us to broaden our range of empathy and compassion. Education that invites us away from our individual corners of the universe to collectively join together in pursuit of solving social problems, tackling inequality, fostering opportunities for joy. Education that sparks a passion for the common good, a concern for the rights and dignity of underrepresented groups, and a responsibility to care and protect those who are unable or less able to do so themselves. Education that is rooted in the firm belief that all people have the potential for personal transformation and that no human is disposable. This is what we should want for all of our students, regardless of whether they're incarcerated or not, and we can measure it. Thank you.